Great. Thank you, everyone, for those of you who are going to join in live and for those of you who are listening offline. Welcome to this week's episode of Meet the meQuanics. As I mentioned last week after our discussions with Tom Stace, our next guest was probably going to be Andrea Morello from the University of New South Wales, and luckily he's found an hour of his time to give me. So, Andrea, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. Hello, everyone.
So, first of all, as I'd like to do with everybody, is to sort of give us a bit of a history of your own work and how you ended up at UNSW working for the Center for Quantum Computing.
Yeah, so I come from a bit of a different field. I started as a student on high temperature superconductivity. So I was actually doing work at very low temperatures and high magnetic fields in Grenoble. And then I did my PhD and my first postdoc on quantum magnetism, in particular on molecular magnets. I was working on large-scale quantum phenomena in magnetic molecules. And then I decided that I wanted to do something different. I wanted to do something where I could use the thing I had learned, in particular the quantum dynamics of complicated spin systems, and apply to something that I didn't know much about at that point, which was semiconductor-based spin quantum computing. And so I found the opportunity to move to Australia to join the Center for Quantum Computer Technology, which back then was directed by Bob Clark, and the goal of which was to build this Kane quantum computer, this visionary idea to build a quantum computer using the spin states of individual phosphorus atoms in silicon. At the time, most people were, to be fair, discouraging me from doing so. They thought I was crazy and they thought it was never going to work. And in fact, for a few years after I came to Australia, which was in late 2006, people still thought it was never going to work, and it indeed did not work straight away. But eventually it did. So basically, it was really a matter of putting together all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. So when I arrived at UNSW in Sydney, there was a lot of expertise on nanofabrication of silicon-based devices. There was a lot of infrastructure, but perhaps what was missing was the experimental and theoretical expertise of how to handle complex spin systems, which is what I brought into the mix. And so between myself and my back then, in fact, supervisor and now very close collaborator, Andrew Zurak, we cracked the nut. So we first managed to get the first spin readout of a single spin in silicon. And then basically from there, as I always tell my students, doing spin resonance on one spin is not any harder than doing it on a million spins.
Yeah.
The hard thing is reading it.
Yeah.
If you figure out how to read one spin, then the rest is actually not all that complicated, although there are some delicacies in how you blast with microwaves a single spin that is placed in the vicinity of a very, very sensitive charge detector, which is what you use for the readout. But those are engineering problems, and we solve them. So we now have, particularly thanks to the use of isotopically enriched silicon-28, which is what people call a semiconductor vacuum, because really it is like vacuum with a band structure.
Right.
We now have essentially the longest coherence time for a single spin in the solid state. We have some of the highest single gate fidelities in the solid state. And so this kind of activity has put silicon-based quantum computing back on the map of what is considered to be a viable option. There's still a lot of work to do, of course, and we're all perfectly aware of what the difficulties are, but I think the vibe is very, very positive and certainly very different than the vibe that was there 10 years ago when I arrived.
So, I mean, we've been talking with people. I try to get a pretty broad range of people who come on this podcast, and I've tried to get at least one person from what I call the seven major systems:
Yeah.
silicon, superconductors, ion traps, quantum dots, diamond, linear optics, and anionic. We've talked with people at Google about their superconducting platform. We talked with Mike Bierchuk a couple of weeks ago about his stuff in ion traps, and we've spoken with Jeremy about linear optics. What was the motivational force for the centre and for the Australians to tackle silicon, considering compared to these other systems, they're not as developed and they're much, much harder to build? So why are the Australians so heavy on this?
Well, first of all, the Kane proposal for building a spin quantum computer in silicon came out of UNSW. Kane was a postdoc of Bob Clark when he wrote that paper.
Mhm.
Right? So he was on site. So the supernova of that visionary idea exploded right here in this building. Why did anyone decide to actually go for it, despite the fact that it was pretty obvious that it was not going to be an easy project? Again, it's one of those personal and historical and logistic coincidences. Bob
Mhm.
Clark was a person of very, very strong will and
I
leadership.
remember.
Yeah, you would know it. And he decided that that was the thing that Australia should try and become famous for. And he managed, to his great credit, he managed to keep a group of 150 people working for 10 years on a project that until, for the first 10 years, essentially did not deliver
Mhm.
results.
Mhm.
Right? You would remember this very well.
Yeah.
But it's not because the project was flawed. It's because, it just took a certain amount of time and gathering a certain amount of, broad expertise before that nut could be cracked. In hindsight, it could have been done in 2001. I mean, the infrastructure was all there.
Mhm.
We could have had the first phosphorus qubit in 2001. Okay. Why didn't we? Well, I mean, I wasn't part of the center back then, but
No, I can't blame you for that one.
that's right. So, you just need to think about it long and hard enough until you find the right way to do it. And in hindsight, it all looks obvious, but until you've seen it, it's not. And then, of course, in a more general sense, if you ask why did anyone want to attack such a hard problem as making silicon behave quantum mechanically, well, that again was actually very, very beautifully expressed in the original Kane proposal, where he said, look, this device that I'm proposing to build looks very, very, ambitious
Mhm.
at the moment. But keep in mind that there is a $1 trillion semiconductor industry whose mode of survival, whose business model it is to follow Moore's law, and so to shrink the size of transistors exponentially. And so in 15 years from now, if Moore's law is followed, the transistors you'll have in your computer will be built at the size required to build this silicon quantum computing device. And lo and behold, that's exactly the case. If you bought yourself a new phone or a new computer, the transistors in there are in the 14 nanometer node, which is the
Mhm.
size of a Kane device. So it was a big gamble, but it wasn't a completely, unfounded gamble. There were all the theoretical and conceptual and also practical and business-wise reasons to invest in this, because silicon is, at the end of the day, the most important material for the modern information technology. I personally think that silicon nanoelectronics is the highest achievement of mankind. It's much
Mhm.
more
Mhm.
impressive than bringing people to the moon and back. If you look at the amount of human ingenuity that goes into building a 14 nanometer chip, with 2 billion transistors. I think that's the highest point of mankind achievements.
Well, maybe one day I'll get an astronomer on, and
Yeah.
you can have a bit of an argument.
Exactly. Well, I can argue my point as strong as you want. I do think so. And
Look, I don't disagree.
yeah,
So I wanted to clarify one thing, because I noticed a paper of yours appear on the archive yesterday with the guys from HRL in California.
Yes.
The stuff that you work on, it's all silicon based, but you jump between these ideas of what's known as quantum dots, which we talked about with Jake Taylor a couple of weeks ago, and the Keynes system, or donor-based quantum computing. Can you maybe give us a bit of a distinction? What's the difference between the two? Why do you work on both of them? Is one easier? Is one better?
They're different, and they are both, they kind of come for free in a sense. So the way it went is the following. The breakthrough in being able to read out the state of a single phosphorus donor qubit, which was the thing that the UNSW and the Australian Center was working on, was to fabricate these silicon, essentially medium scale quantum dots at the 100 electron level as the readout devices. So it was integrating a donor with a medium sized quantum dot. That was the breakthrough to make it work. Okay. Now, once you've made this quantum dot, then for a very, very small additional effort, you can ask yourself, how about I make it just a little bit smaller than the size necessary for me to read out the spin of the phosphorus? And I squeeze out all the electrons except the last one. Then you've made a single electron quantum dot, and the electron in that dot has almost the same coherence properties as the electron that's bound to the donor. So in a sense, the quantum dot program is born out of the phosphorus donor qubit program. And then once you have a working single electron quantum dot, and you use the same magnetic resonance techniques that we've developed to run the donor qubits, you use them for the quantum dots, then really the platforms run in parallel. So that's why I am involved in this work. I mean, as a kind of general rule, I focus more on the donors, and Andrew Zurak focuses more on the dots. But you will notice if you look at the papers that we are always in each other's papers, not just because we stick the name on it, but because we actually, a lot of the things that my group develops primarily for the donors is then used in the quantum control of the quantum dots. And a lot of the techniques that Andrew's group developed to make the quantum dots smaller, more reliable, better laid out is then used to improve the layout of the donor devices. So there's a continuous parallelism in the stream of research between our groups. And so you will see me appearing in both types of papers, although normally, let's say as a general divide, I tend to lead the donor work, and Andrew Zurak tends to lead the dots work.
I mean, is it basically you're just covering as many bases as possible, or is there an anticipated benefit of having a donor-based computer versus a dot-based computer?
Look, you can make a very simple list of the pros and cons, and you can then decide whether it's worth pursuing both. We have made the decision that it's worth pursuing both, in particular because the additional effort necessary to pursue both programs is really minimal. As I said, once you've decided to have a donors program, having a dot program adds 10%,
right,
in terms of technicality. And the same thing, once you've decided to make quantum dots like that, implanting a donor next to it is not a big addition. So they really kind of come, buy two, pay one in a sense. And so there really isn't much of a cost cutting in choosing one over the other. They really both come together. But if you wanted to have a bit of a conversation about what are the pros and cons of each, the great thing about the donors is, of course, the nuclear spin. So the donor has this fantastic resource, which is the nuclear spin, that you can use as a quantum memory. you can use as a standalone qubit with 35 seconds coherent time in the solid state. You can use it as a readout ancilla. So one thing we've done a lot is not very much in the published literature yet, but we are coming out with a number of papers, you'll see them in the next few months, where we essentially map the electron state onto the nuclear state, and then we read out the nucleus, simply because the nucleus allows you for a quantum non-demolition readout. So on the nuclear spin, we can get easily 99.9% readout fidelities, which are very, very hard to get on the electron alone.
And this is a direct nuclear spin measurement?
Yes. Well, it's always intermediated via the electron. So the way you
Right.
read the nucleus is that you do a pi pulse on the electron, which then depends on the nuclear state.
Right.
But the point is, the nucleus keeps its state when you read the electron. So you can just repeat it over and over again. If you do 100 repetitions of readout that way, you get 99.9% fidelity is easy on the nucleus. It's a Q&D measurement, whereas the electron one is not.
Right.
That's the real difference. The flip side of the donor is that you need to place it in the right spot. So there is an extra complication in implanting it and placing it and controlling the interaction with its neighbors. The quantum dots have the advantage that in principle everything is tunable. So exchange interactions between the dot can be gate tuned. And overall, the whole construction of a dot-based processor is at face value more obviously compatible with the standard semiconductor CMOS processing. I mean, implanting donors is not outside the standard CMOS processing. I mean, every CMOS transistor has ion implanted source and drain, so that's not in itself a deviation from the norm, but it's counting and locating single donors that is an additional complication.
And this idea of having atomically precise placement, the phosphorus has got to be in the right spot next to each other.
Yeah, so as you know, there is a whole other research program that's led by Michel Simmons that looks at using scanning tunneling microscopes for the purpose of placing dopants with atomic precision. That's had, of course, fantastic success and progress. You could argue in that case that fabrication route is a very, very substantial deviation from standard, silicon electronics fabrication, right? That process flow does not resemble the way that the chip in your computer is fabricated. So it's silicon, but it's not, CMOS in that sense.
Right. But I mean, the chips that you run on, the donor-based chip, so it's not grown using Michel's technique. It's still ion implantation.
Yes, it's ion implantation. Yes.
Right. And so what, you have, I mean, have you guys, it's been obviously a long time since I used to work for the center. Do you now have better control over when you're doing an ion implantation, or do you still basically fire in the ions and then sort of build everything around it?
We still do it that way. Of course, David Jamieson in Melbourne has kept working and is making interesting progress on perfecting the technique for implanting and counting individual ions at precise location. But so far, we have done everything essentially by having some redundancy. So instead of firing just one ion, we fire a few of them, and then we go and select the one that's in the right place. So this is not an eminently scalable technology, as you can imagine, but it's perfectly fine for basic, proof of principle demonstrations. And while the group of David Jamieson is ramping up the effort to count and locate single ions in accurate positions, what my group is doing is, in fact, some, you can call it, proposals and theory work on having forms of interaction between the qubits that are not based on exchange interaction.
So they don't have to be aligned to each other.
Exactly. So we have a paper that's been on the archive for nearly 1 year now. It's still under review. It's improving a lot. So the reviewers were very, very professional and very competent, but they demanded a lot of further work, which is great because the paper is now in really great shape. Anyway, so we've had this proposal out for a while now to use electric dipole interaction instead of exchange interaction. So this is something that has been overlooked for a long, long time in this field, is that if you distort the wave function of the electron bound to the donor, you effectively create an electric dipole. And of course, electric dipoles couple to each other quite strongly, and they couple at long distance, and the interaction goes like 1/r³ instead of being exponential, with then valley oscillations on top of that. So it's a much more forgiving kind of interaction. And so we're now working on a whole proposal which actually would allow us to make a 2D array, which can then be adapted to the sort of 2D error correction that is most popular these days, and where the atomically precise placement of the donors is not necessary. So if you actually do the numbers, you find that the optimal distance between the donors in this type of architecture, where you make them interact by electric dipole, is 180 nanometers. That's a long way out. And given that, even just as it is now, the ion implantation technique gives us 10 nanometer, plus or minus 10 nanometer precision, between 170 and 190 nanometer distance with a 1/r³ interaction, actually not much changes. So it's actually compatible with the ion implantation precision as we have it now.
So you might be able to still go with an architecture that's built from this sort of top-down implantation approach.
Absolutely. We're pretty confident that that's got a lot of future, lots of fuel in its tank.
So, I mean, you guys have gotten to the point now where you can initialize a donor-based qubit, you can measure it, you can obviously do single qubit gates on the donor, and you can interact the nuclear degree of freedom with the electronic qubit.
That's right, yeah.
Have you gotten two donors interacting together?
We have a paper, it's in PRL 2014. We saw a pair of exchange coupled donors. We actually learned a lot from that experiment, but it was in the wrong regime. So it was a device where we found two coupled donors, but the coupling was very strong. So it was too strong for us to do any, 2-qubit operations, because the coupling was basically overwhelming everything else. But we learned a lot about the physics of exchange interactions between donors. So it was a nice, let's call it semiconductor physics exercise. Unfortunately, it wasn't yet useful for 2-qubit logic gates, but we have seen, interacting donors already.
So I imagine that that's sort of the next major push, is to try to get two of these things talking to each other cleanly and at high fidelity.
Of course. I mean, we understand perfectly well. Again, we have a paper, it's a theory paper where we describe how to run reliably a 2-qubit logic gate between exchange coupled donors that does not require either tuning or precision in the exchange interaction. All it requires is to prepare the nuclear spins in opposite state. If you can prepare the nuclear spins in opposite state and the exchange interaction is weaker than the hyperfine interaction, then you basically get a 2-qubit logic gate that looks, from a formal point of view, very similar to the way that superconducting qubits do it. You have two qubits that are detuned by an amount that is stronger than the coupling.
Right.
That's a classic way to do 2-qubit logic gates. You just do a resonance on one qubit, and that resonance frequency of one qubit depends on the state of the other. So that's your C0 gate.
Right.
And so the hyperfine interaction for phosphorus donors is 120 megahertz. So you need an exchange interaction that is less than that and more than the line width. But the line width is 1 kilohertz in silicon-28.
Well, we might be getting to the language now that's a little bit highbrow.
Okay, yeah. So what I'm saying is that there are a few orders of magnitude tolerance in what exchange interaction we can allow for this two-qubit logic gate to work.
Mhm.
So as you correctly guess, we're working very hard now to make batches of devices with donors implanted at an average distance that will make the exchange interaction fall into the window that will allow us to do this C-naught gate mediated by the control of the nucleus spins.
So, I mean, not to preempt you by too much, but I mean, when do you think you guys might be able to do this? Do you think it's something that could happen in the next 6 to 12 months, or you're going to need a little bit more time?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, all it takes is to have a device with two donors in the right place, whereby in the right place, I mean, where the exchange interaction is within the 2 or 3 orders of magnitude range that makes this sort of two-qubit logic gate work. Once that device is there and it works and it's in the fridge, we can get a two-qubit logic gate working within a week.
Right.
We know exactly what we need to do. We just need to find the right device.
Okay. So speaking a little bit more sort of far into the future, I mean, there was a well-known paper published last year led by the Melbourne group in Science Advances. And obviously within the media and the stuff that's been happening in Sydney and Australia, we've heard a lot about sort of the long-term vision for a silicon-based quantum computer. Certainly, since you're the person on the ground, you're the one trying to physically build these objects. I mean, I'd love to get your opinion about sort of these much more loftier goals when it comes to a large-scale error-corrected machine.
Right. So again, it's the kind of thing where you want to take it step by step. So you mentioned the paper that came out on the archive from, it's actually led from the HRL group, but with Andrew and I chipping in our experimental insights. So we've been looking at making a linear array of dots, logical qubit, which would be the first kind of embryonic demonstration of an error-corrected logical qubit in silicon.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, linear architectures, as you know very well, tend not to, scale perfectly well at the very.
Well, they can't be made fault tolerant, unfortunately.
Right. So at the same time, both myself and Andrew are looking at 2D architectures. This paper I mentioned before, where we propose the use of electric dipole interactions, is indeed pointing at a 2D architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And we are actually working with other collaborators now to look at exactly how to run it and what the thresholds would be in the particular way that we run it, and also see if we can maybe make use of the fact that the electric dipole interaction is not just nearest neighbor. I mean, in principle, it goes to the second nearest neighbor. So it can be a nuisance, it can be a resource if you can use it.
Yeah.
And then Andrew, for example, is working on again 2D array where extensive use is made of CMOS fabrication capability. So if you actually look, how do you wire up all these quantum dots? How do you control them? How do you connect them to each other in a 2D array? You need to have many layers of interconnects, which is exactly what you have in normal, classical computer chips. So we've been looking at how to integrate, and that's really the original motivation for a silicon program, right? So we've done all this hard work to make silicon behave quantum, to put spins in there that work as good qubits. Now is the time to use the extraordinary know-how and technological infrastructure that is there in the microelectronic chips industry and apply it to then scale up into the arrays, this kind of qubits. That's really the future for us.
So, I mean, if we were trying to compare, I mean, we were talking about the benefits, obviously, of silicon, the fact that it can be smaller, it can leverage this entire silicon industry that's existed for 60, 70 years, maybe longer. And potentially, although we haven't really spoken about this, the potential for silicon to be fast in terms of gate operations. Now, if you compare this, say, for example, to the work that we talked about with the guys from Google,
Yep.
they're doing 9 qubits now. Rumor has it that they are pushing towards a 49 qubit device to demonstrate something called quantum supremacy. They can provably do something that a classical computer cannot. Obviously, silicon is behind on this technology, but in terms of playing catch up, do you see yourself basically moving in parallel with them, or do you think that you can make some pretty impressive leaps and bounds and maybe sort of leapfrog closer in the next 10 or 20 years?
Well, so if I had to make a guess, the purpose of which is, of course, for me to be proven wrong every time I make a guess in this field.
That's fine. That's fine.
But if I have to make a guess, I would guess that this will go in bursts. So I would guess that we'll get some, 2-3 qubits working really nicely in the next couple of years, get nice, gate fidelities, and all looks nice and rosy. And maybe push it to a little bit beyond those few qubits, and then maybe there would be a bit of a stalling at some point, while other technologies such as superconductors or ion traps keep moving ahead. But I think silicon might have a big explosion at some point down the track, which can be 5 years, can be 10 years from now, or who knows when. I think when really we manage to integrate foundry-based processes with our qubits. So the question is really actually very simple. Can we make a highly coherent, fully controllable with the, we got 3 nines fidelities on everything by now, right? So this, at the single qubit level, the silicon qubits are some of the best you can get in a solid state. And the Zurak's group has demonstrated a 2-qubit logic gate with the quantum dots. It didn't manage to get, randomized benchmarking values for the gate fidelity, but it's pretty good. It's going to be in the 99% without particular optimization. So the question is, can you harness and exploit the intrinsic quality of the spin qubits we're making in silicon using a billion-dollar foundry process?
Right.
If the answer to that is yes, I think the speed at which we add qubits to a silicon processor will be blistering, right?
Right.
Because if you can make a spin qubit in silicon using the same process that, let's say, Intel or AMD or TSMC uses to make one of the billion transistors you have in your computer right in front of you, then making one or making a billion really is the same thing.
Yeah.
Those things, the process is so extraordinarily well controlled, right? That's the whole key of silicon. I mean, at this point, we are, of course, bragging about the long coherence time, the gate fidelity is all well and good. But the real reason we're doing this is because if these coherence times and gate fidelities remain when we make these devices using the fabrication processes and the exquisite control and reproducibility that you have in a silicon CMOS foundry, then the rate at which you keep adding qubits will be just mind-blowing.
It'll be the same way as with classical transistors.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you guys interact with any of these places that you've mentioned, like Intel or AMD? Is there at least sort of some first, I don't know, sort of stepping stone discussions about how this might be done?
Yes. So there's discussions going on. As you can well imagine, there are things other than science that play a role in this sort of discussion.
Of course.
But yes, of course, this is exactly the moment when we are having these discussions and we are looking at partners for actually.
Well, Intel did invest $50 million into the Dutch effort, so they obviously must be interested.
They are very interested indeed, yes.
And actually, this could leapfrog nicely into the next part of our conversation, sort of in regards to quantum computing in general in Sydney and Australia. A lot of people would have noticed I remember I was in Canada at the time, We had 2 weeks, one after the other, where you had Justin Trudeau in Waterloo investing into perimeter, and then the next week you had two big openings in Australia, the Nanotech Centre at Sydney and this new round of funding that you guys have gotten at UNSW.
That's right.
This is separate from the Centre for Quantum Computing. This is a whole different sort of branch of money, and it involves also private sector investment. So how much can you tell us about that?
Well, so what happened was that the federal government committed $26 million to creating essentially an incubator for the demonstration of small to medium scale silicon quantum computer.
Mm-hmm.
This is additional and separate from the Center for Quantum Computer Technology. So the center's job is really to work out the science of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this funding is to actually make prototype devices. Of course, one feeds into the other, but
Mm-hmm.
they are strictly speaking separate efforts.
Yeah.
And this really was the hope of the government, and it seems to have been realized. Within a few days, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia committed $10 million, and then Telstra committed $10 million.
Mm-hmm.
So that's exactly what the hope was, is that with a initial push and boost from government, that then the private sector would come in and join the group and help creating a true Australian hub for silicon quantum computing. Because, I mean, let's face it, Australia, as you know very well, has pioneered all this and has invested a lot over this 17 years.
Comparative to its research budgets and its research population, Australia has invested a huge amount.
Exactly. And so there is a very, very strong feeling and desire to make this actually go somewhere. I think most people, and myself included, I mean, I am an Australian citizen now. I mean, I obviously don't come from Australia, but I feel almost like a civic responsibility towards Australia to make this work. Like the Australian scientific community has devoted so much of its resources to this project that I think we really have a almost civic responsibility to get somewhere.
So, I mean, from your perspective, and obviously I know you can't talk about everything, but especially with regards to the Commonwealth Bank and Telstra. Now, I mean, $10 million for corporations such as those two is not a huge amount of money, but they must have had some themselves. They must have had some internal discussions, and why are they interested? I know I do some work with Q Branch, and then they talk to the financial sector quite a lot about the possibilities. But in terms of sort of what a quantum computer can do, it's not like we have anything obvious that we can push towards, a telecommunications company and a bank, certainly at this stage. So what was their interest?
Well, there are people within both those companies who, understand the science, and they're perfectly aware that, within 2 years, they will not get something out of us that makes their business model change or get better. But they understand that having a presence in this effort can pay a lot of benefits in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
They want to be part of the game. They want to help progressing in this field, and they want to be the first ones who reap the benefits when benefits are there to be had. And they're not deluded. I mean, they know perfectly well that within the next few years, there isn't an immediate application of a 10-qubit silicon quantum computer to whatever business interest they have. But that's not the point. They want to be supporting and participating and making sure that if and when the benefits come up, they were involved from the start. This also, of course, has a lot to do with intellectual property and things like this.
Of course. So in terms of your interaction, I mean, does the CBA and Telstra, are they just sort of sitting there and sort of, we've now got our fingers in the pie, or are they cross collaborations? Are people coming to UNSW? Are you sending people to the bank?
There are mostly people coming to UNSW, and of course delegations of, some people from the center going to their offices. There are constant, conversations and discussions for what is the expectation from both parties. But my perception of it is that everyone is very, very realistic about these things. I mean, people in these corporate entities are completely realistic and aware of what's there, and they just think that it's worth it. So,
yeah, well, you don't spend $10 million with doing no research into what you're spending it on. But I mean, globally, this certainly, I like hearing, because I'm a theorist, I always like hearing perspectives of people who actually have to build this stuff.
Yeah.
We're now seeing that this quite large push globally with the UK quantum hubs. It's quite a large investment from private companies such as Google and Microsoft and IBM.
Yeah.
This recent €1 billion announcement coming from the EU. This melding now between sort of the private sector, or at least private investors, and what has been for the last 15, 20 years, a research direction that's been very academic. So do you think we are now seeing this push, that it is moving out of academia and into industry more, or is it real sort of, it's still sort of an academic interest, but it's going to move within the next 10 or 15 years into, largely private sector hands?
I think it is definitely moving towards the private sector, and I would argue that it has to. I feel, as an experimentalist working in this field, that the kind of contribution that I can give to this field, being, one professor with, 5 students and 3 postdocs,
Mm-hmm.
goes only up to a certain point, right? I mean, a large-scale, useful quantum computer is an object of a size and complexity that I don't believe is amenable to a normal university size research group
Mm-hmm.
activity. I mean, I think that's a pretty obvious thing to say, but
Yeah.
I just have to say. So it is a matter of life or death to engage with large-scale industrial partners and approach the problem from the point of view of a large system integration problem. It's the only way. It's that or nothing.
Well, luckily, it does seem to be working in every major place of the planet where people are actively looking at this stuff.
That's right. And of course, the private sector realizes that the potential for returns in this field is also enormous.
Mm-hmm.
If you actually get a working, useful quantum computer, it's going to be an investment that definitely pays back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we're coming up on our 45, 50 minutes now. So the last 2 things, and I try and do this for everybody, is as I've said to our other guests, there's a bottle of whiskey of your choice that we're looking for a pretty solid prediction of what you think is going to happen in the next 10-ish years in regards to your technology and in regards to the global development of quantum computing. And if we're all still around in 10 years' time, we'll come back to these episodes and figure out who was closest.
So do I get the bottle of whiskey for making the prediction or for getting the prediction right?
We're getting the prediction right.
Oh, Simon.
I've had 17 episodes. I'm not buying 17 bottles of whiskey.
Oh, man. All right, so prediction for the next 10 years. I think in the next 10 years, okay, I'm gonna make a big one.
Okay.
I think within the next 10 years, we will have found out whether or not chaos plays a role in quantum computing.
Ah, that's an interesting one.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we've never had something like this before.
Yeah. So I think in the next 10 years, somebody will realize either, I mean, it's kind of I'm taking a two-way bet.
That's fine, that's
But
fine.
I'm saying someone will realize that either there is some fundamental reason why um, chaotic phenomena simply do not play any role in quantum computation, or that they actually play a major role.
Hmm.
And maybe that will help us clarifying the boundary between the quantum and the classical world. That that there is this general field of quantum chaos where you try to figure out how is it that quantum mechanics does not contain chaos. The time evolution operator is a linear unitary operator, so there
Hmm.
is no chaos in quantum mechanics, strictly speaking, and yet almost everything at the classical level is chaotic. Where does that come about, and where
Yep,
is the
yep.
boundary, right? And so let me rephrase my prediction. I predict that within the next 10 years, it will become clear that a quantum computer can be a machine, either experimentally or conceptually, that clarifies the boundary between the quantum and the classical world, particularly in regards to aspects of chaos.
That's a pretty solid idea and a pretty
You like
solid
that?
prediction for 10. Yeah, I quite like that. That's been my favorite so far.
Oh, wonderful. Do I get a
Yeah.
bottle of whiskey already just for being
Well, well, maybe the next time I come back, home, maybe.
Okay.
So we're coming up now on the end of this podcast. So the very last thing is there anything happening in Sydney? Anything you want to plug? Any interesting events or opportunities that you want to mention?
Look, I'll tell you something a little bit on the side, but I quite enjoy it. I've been doing a fair bit of work together with artists.
Hmm.
So there is a colleague, in fact, he's a professor at the College of Fine Arts at UNSW, he's a visual artist, and he approached me to do some artistic explorations on the quantum world. And it was a very interesting experience because at the start I was, somewhat struggling to, absorb the kind of language that he used. Sometimes it comes dangerously close to the, quantum new age wishy-washy stuff you sometimes hear. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but this guy is real. He's the real deal. And so he created an artwork that has been exhibited a number of times, including very recently for the Sydney Science Festival, which is an immersive artwork where you basically, he did it with an Oculus Rift in this case, but he's trying to do it in the dome at the College of Fine Arts. It's an
Ah,
immersive audiovisual artwork where you basically find yourself inside the block sphere of a spin. The visuals are very complex and fascinating, but the interesting thing is that this was built upon raw data from my qubit experiment from my lab. So it's
ah.
actually, yeah. But there's something that's beyond that this is really a nice story I like to tell. So I just gave him, like, the Rabi oscillation of a qubit, and you think, okay, fine, go with that. But it wasn't enough. He wanted something more. And he said, Andrea, I would like to communicate to the qubit. I would like to speak to the qubit. And in particular, I would like to read to the qubit the seminal paper of Richard Feynman, where he first brought out the idea of using quantum system to simulate other quantum systems, which is, in a sense, the embryo of what we now call quantum computing.
Mhm.
And, I listened to him and I said, look, mate, I mean, come on. But then, no, wait, guess, my student had a brilliant idea. He said, well, you know what we do? Instead of just applying, a constant frequency microwave tone to Rabi oscillate the qubit, we can frequency modulate the carrier using the voice of the artist while he's reading the Richard Feynman paper.
Mm-hmm.
So the artist recorded himself reading the paper of Richard Feynman, and then we ran an experiment where we were doing Rabi oscillations on the qubit, but the frequency of the microwave drive was frequency modulated by the voice of the artist reading Richard Feynman. And then we were doing state tomography on the qubit as it was going on. And then we gave him the data, and he's now putting it all together. So, I mean, it all looks, of course, like the qubit is going all over the place, as you would imagine. But, you know, that's actually really profound, I think. It's quite beautiful. Like you're talking, you're reading the Feynman paper to a spin in silicon using essentially what is like an FM radio broadcasting, right?
Mm-hmm. See, I would have imagined that you would have seen, you might have been able to map the modulations in the microwave frequency to modulations in the Rabi frequency, or modulations in the Rabi amplitude, as you did the experiment.
We decided to just do it really the FM radio wave. I mean, there's various ways you can modulate, but we just went for the crude FM radio wave. At the end of the day, I mean, you just get a spin that goes all over the place, but it's just the concept of it,
Yeah. So wait, this is still being exhibited, or this is?
No, this has not yet been put together. So what's been exhibited was the simple Rabi oscillation, and now he's putting together the one with the Feynman paper being read to the qubits. So this is work in progress. But a snapshot of it. So we published in Nature Nanotechnology a few months ago the violation of Bell's inequality between the electron and the nuclear spin of the phosphorus atom, and that made it on the front cover of Nature Nano, using a still image from that artwork. So if you go to the March 2016 issue of Nature Nanotechnology, the cover image is actually a still image from this artwork that we have created together with this professional professor of drawing, in fact.
Well, I'll put that on our Twitter account when I can find it.
That's right.
Okay, well, that's probably a good spot to end the conversation today. So once again, Andrea, thank you so much for giving me an hour of your time and sitting down and finally somebody to have a chat about silicon. So everyone else, thank you again for tuning in and listening. This will be uploaded to our various accounts later today. As I said last week, we're now available on the Google Play Store as well as the iTunes Store and SoundCloud. So please subscribe and download a new episode when they come out. Our next episode, as I mentioned last week, will be with Andrew Cross from IBM Research, where he will be talking about their superconducting systems and the release of the quantum experience, which is the first, well, technically it's the second, but it's the first large, or reasonably large quantum processor that's available to be programmed over the internet. So please stay tuned to our feeds, and the date and time will be notified as soon as it's confirmed. So thanks everyone, and thanks again, Andrea.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Cheers.